So hi everyone, welcome. I think we can begin. And if anybody else is joining, they can just join in the next few minutes. I'm sure they won't miss too much. So we'll start with some introductions. I hope everybody can hear me well. Great. So my name is Leo. I'm from Falkor, and welcome to our webinar. So today we have two speakers. Ari Benham, who's our senior analyst at Falkor, and you might also know him from his insightful newsletter and other places. And we have Matteo from District 4. They'll introduce themselves as well. I think we can start presenting. We will have some time for questions at the end. So please just listen. And if you do have any questions during the presentation, just write them down in the chat. We'll try to answer live. If not, we'll answer at the end. And we hope you enjoy.
All right. Thanks, Leo. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Matteo and everyone else joining, who's already joined and will be joining us shortly. So let's kick this off with a brief presentation on breach data and what we're going to be discussing, and then we'll get into the actual investigative use case right afterwards. So on that note, I'm going to now struggle with Canva to share my screen. I'm not used to using this, so forgive me, everyone. Welcome. Like Leo said, I'm Ari. In addition to being responsible for everything OSINT related to Falkor, I also am the co-founder of Telemetry Data Labs, which you may have come across the Telegram search engine. I write at memeticwarfare.io on influence operations and cyber operations as well. And I'm very annoying on LinkedIn. So that's about me. Matteo, do you want to introduce yourself briefly before we continue?
Sure. First of all, pleasure to be here with you guys. So my name is Matteo Tomasini, founder and CTO of District 4 Labs. Company's been around for about a year and a half or so. Before that, I was at a consulting company called Prescient. Before that, at Blue Voyant, a cybersecurity company based out of New York, which I was one of the founding members of, and then at K2 Intelligence. So background mostly in investigations and cyber.
All right, let's keep going. So we're going to talk a little bit before we begin about what breach data is and to give you guys the foundational background that you need to really get into this, right? So breach data is essentially what it sounds like, data that's been acquired and made public via a breach, right, or intrusion of a given company. This can happen for a variety of reasons. You hear about these essentially every day, whether it was the recent large breach of Snowflake, whether it's companies getting hacked and having their data posted online, whether it's from ransomware, which is what we'll discuss a little bit. But breach data is really critical, and I always personally describe it, Matteo, you may want to describe it differently, as what kind of powers the cybercrime underground, right? Which is one of the reasons why people post it, essentially, because that's one of the questions I get asked all the time. Why do people bother hacking into all these companies and organizations and then posting all of their data online, as we can see here, be it on forums, right, on Telegram, or so on. So in addition to it powering the broader cybercrime underground in ways that we'll see shortly, right, people also post breach data online for hacktivism and ideological reasons. We can see here one over here, for example, of a breach of an Israeli government agency with some breach documents on drones, right? So hacktivism and ideology is one of those nation-state hack and leak operations are increasingly popular, right? Whether it's somebody hacking Kaspersky with Casper leaks or Russia hacking a different, Ukrainian organization, whatever it happens to be. Corporate competition, whistleblowers, tons of other reasons as well, right? So you have the financially motivated people posting it, and you also have people motivated for a variety of other reasons, like any cyber threat actor. Let's continue then. It's also exploited, right, specifically by threat actors. So this is where the financial element comes in. Okay, so great. You have some breach data. Somebody hacked into a company and stole their user database, let's say, right? What are you now going to do with that? Well, you can take that data and sell it as is, if you're the hacker, right, to other cyber criminals as a raw breach, as what's called a combo list, right, where people combine usernames and passwords and other information, right, to then be resold later on, or as the individual breach itself. Stealer logs are also quite common as well. And one of the most impactful leaks that we had recently was, in fact, the Snowflake leak. We have Mandiant's incident response diagram over here of the attack path, where acquired Snowflake credentials, right, from an internal user at Snowflake were taken from this Stealer log and then utilized to essentially compromise the Snowflake network. Now, Stealer logs are a bit of a different situation compared to regular breach data, what we're thinking of, where essentially a Stealer log scenario is when a given device is fully compromised by a stealer, like Redline or so on. And that leads to essentially all of the data on that device being then taken by that software and sent back to the operator to then be resold. right? Combo lists are also sold as is on Telegram. I see, Matteo, if you want to add something here, please feel free, jump in.
Oh, no,
I know you
I
guys
was just
probably
going to
want to
say
go
that, yeah, no, so obviously, cyber threat actors can use the data, and, there's all this talk about the end of passwords, et cetera, but leaks of credentials is still, I think, even Verizon put out their annual report saying like that was the primary factor in getting access to an organization was through credentials. But, and kind of Ari alluded to it a bit here, like social engineering targets, et cetera. There's a lot more data in these compromised records than just passwords, right? There's addresses, there's passport numbers, there's bank account numbers. There's a whole lot of sensitive PII that threat actors can use either to further get into a system or to target an individual, like a high net worth individual, executive, et cetera. You can learn almost everything about them through breach records, things that aren't available in public records. So it becomes very, very interesting.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said any better. Anyway, Matteo, what you were saying earlier, the number of breaches are on the rise yearly now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So like there's just more and more and more breaches. There've been giant leaps, especially, during COVID when, more and more systems went online. A lot of organizations that previously weren't online as much, there was a huge focus on the education sector, for example. And you're just seeing more and more and more breaches, every year, and the trends are continuing. It's still going to be initial access points from, phishing attacks that, force an individual to enter their credentials, or from, the rise of the malware logs that we'll talk about later.
So now how can we actually then use these investigations? Well, we have a few here to do. Yeah, let's see if you want to jump in, please. I'm very happy we're keeping it casual here. We can talk. I can talk how I use breach data. I use breach data all the time. It is one of my favorite ways I have for investigating essentially any entity type, right? I use it in cyber investigations primarily, including looking into domains, investigating influence operations, right, to de-anonymize certain accounts that are involved in these networks and so on, but also for due diligence, right? I'm looking into a person who's suspect of say fraud, or happens to be. You can often find relevant information by looking up their email address or phone number, leading you to things that they wouldn't want to be public, right? But are of course affiliated to them still via breach data.
Yeah, no, just like you, Ari, I'm completely obsessed with breach data. Obviously, I started a company for it, but like it's something that I've used even before District 4 in pretty much every investigation that I ever did. Obviously, we'd use it for, as part of a cyber assessment, whether it's a pen test or a vulnerability assessment. In due diligence, we'd use it to learn more about an individual, right? So much of a person's online or life is online now. And, you have the kind of the first kind of tier, which was public records. Then people started looking at social media. This is kind of like that third, more expansive tier where you can now look at all the accounts that they created online that you might not know that they might not want you to know that they created online. So oftentimes you're finding stuff under pseudonyms, et cetera, and it gives you information about a person, right? In breach data, we obviously have all this great person identifying information, but if you find them in a breach of a website, it means that they were a member of that website, right? So a lot of breaches have occurred of ultra right-wing organizations, or dark web marketplaces, or hacker forums, et cetera. So if you find your subject in one of those breaches, it means they had an account there. So it obviously colors who they are, et cetera. And this is data that's used by everybody, right? Law enforcement's using it, national intelligence, corporate security, et cetera. And it's really anytime you have an individual or a company you want to learn more about, use breach data. It almost seems silly to say, but it can really add a lot of value to almost every investigation that you do. So it's been a tremendous source. Even threat attribution has been like a big one, and that's kind of we'll talk about a little bit about with the use case, like learning who's behind a username on Twitter, or account on some random forum, or an email, like a threatening email. It's just incredibly useful, and it really goes a lot further when you can only go so far with public records or social media, et cetera. Breach records, more often than not, will take me the rest of the way there. So I'm a huge fan.
I couldn't agree more. I also find in particular that it's maybe the best thing to utilize when you hit a natural stopping point in an investigation, right? Where you kind of like, you've looked through you look person's names, looked in the public records, looked at their email addresses and phone numbers. You have a solid understanding, but you kind of don't have anywhere else to pivot to. That's oftentimes when it provides that connecting point that you need to really keep moving. And that's due to the nature of breach data, right? So what essentially is Darkside, right, or breach data tools? Well, what they are really, right, are normalized databases of these breaches, right? And you can input into and search across these databases almost any kind of identifier: names, physical addresses, email and phone numbers, user IDs from social media accounts, cryptocurrency wallets. Matteo, if you want to add any other particularly interesting query types in District 4, feel free to add here before I continue.
Yeah, no, it's literally just anything you can think of. Yeah, so social media IDs, even social media handles, bank account numbers, passport numbers, VIN numbers, license plate numbers, driver's license numbers, really anything you can think of has been compromised pretty much on anyone in the world. And like a lot of these databases, like Darkside obviously is global. So it's not just Americans, it's not just, Europeans, it's literally everybody in the world. And it's probably a little bit in the world, probably like 20, I'm in there like 60, 70 times. Like it's crazy. So just an obscene amount of data.
Absolutely. And then what I think is one of the biggest upsides of using it is that it's full rows of data, right? So here we have an example of the LinkedIn breach, but this could be any breach essentially, right? If you can search any one of these identifiers, you'll then get a lot of other affiliated ones, all from that one result that you happen to have. Think about the data that you put into a site when you register: your registration IP, your last IP, your username, the name, your display name, your email address, your phone number, potentially, your password, right? All these things are going to retrieve at a minimum from the majority of breach records. And that means that you can really pivot incredibly effectively off of these, especially if you have good results there. I also find that it's critical for hard targets. We'll discuss that a little bit also. And it's also really cost effective. Like, I mean, when you look at the results per query, oftentimes, and you'll see this in the case that we get to a little bit, you'll look up an email address and you might get hundreds of results in certain cases, right? Now, that might be a bit of an edge case even, but even if you get dozens of results, if you're carrying out due diligence, profiling, any sort of investigation, in terms of bang for buck per query, it's definitely up there, if not one of the leading sources for value. And this is also, by the way, what we're discussing now with the hard target use is probably one of the reasons I enjoy it the most, right? Nobody lives truly off the grid. You don't need social media accounts. You can keep all your email addresses private. You can do all of this fun stuff. But for government services and for other requirements, you're still going to have to register under some form of real identifier, right? That can be exchanges that have KYC requirements, right, for crypto. Those can be government agencies. Those can be banks and so on. Those can be food delivery services, right? Those can be tax filings. These are all things that we happen to have. And then when you throw into that bad OPSEC habits that people have, like password pivoting, which we'll see also in a little bit, you can really break, even people with good OPSEC, you can really break their OPSEC and find that piece of information you need to keep it going.
Yeah, and one of the things we also like to add is, yeah, you have all this great data, and let's say you do have, a threat actor who has amazing operational security, right? They create all their accounts using VPNs, they use a different username on everything, etc. But the beauty of, breach data and the beauty of, Darkside is our data goes back like, decade plus. So you have data from 12, 15, 20 years ago, and maybe that, super hacker or whatever who's operating today, maybe 7, 8 years ago, they were just some kid who signed up for like, really, bad Minecraft account or something, and they used their real name there. So the beauty in when you're doing pivots, in systems like, Falkor, we're able to easily pivot, is you can essentially pivot back into time, right? So you can start with an email to a username to a password, and you're not just pivoting on accounts that were created in the last couple of years or whatever. But we had a Ukrainian hacker who basically had amazing operational security, but we started to pivot until we got to an account that they created in 2010, which actually had their real address. So it's a beautiful resource for that, especially with hard targets. You'll learn a lot about them, but even if they have perfect OPSEC today, can almost guarantee they didn't in the past. And that's been the case with our current person and a lot of people you probably read about in the news, like the breach forums guys, the raid forums guys, etc.
Absolutely. We have other cases of that also, Iranian hackers, Chinese state hackers, whatever you want, that all nowadays are working for the state and are supposed to maintain good OPSEC, but don't. And I've used that, by the way, in the past also to not only find out more information about them, but also uncover new malicious infrastructure, right? Whether there's a C2 server leak, or whether they're utilizing, the same highly unique password to register phishing emails, right? I've come across all that, in the past as well, and it's quite, something. I'll take this slide because I'm the one not affiliated with Darkside here. But let's talk the current state of compromised data tooling, right? If you want to utilize tools for this, the majority of the tools you're going to be utilizing are either the very low end kind of free ones that don't provide a lot of information, or the ones that are affordable, I mean very cheap essentially, what I'm trying to say, but are black hat. You're not sure where the data is coming from, wouldn't necessarily hold up in court. There are ethical issues. Maybe they're getting it from unethical sources. They're purchasing breach files directly from cyber criminals. A lot of serious questions there that we can discuss also later on potentially, right? And also the coverage, frankly, isn't that great. And there usually aren't advanced search features, right? Like Darkside has, the Matteo I'll get to shortly. They also usually aren't integrated into investigation platforms. They're kind of these black hat standalone toolings, solutions that are okay at best and suspicious to say the least, or at the worst.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And like that's kind of the whole reason. So Darkside is a relatively new company. I mentioned that I used breach data in the past. And my whole thing was I just never found like a great database, a great tool that had everything that I needed. A lot of them were either these weird, sketchy sites that would get shut down by the FBI every other day. Some of the ones that are still out there now, like it's obvious that they're doing some of the hacking themselves, but then you're not able to search in the way that I would want to search as an investigator. Some of the more kind of expensive platforms that are out there that, are kind of similar in capability, they're more focused on account takeover, kind of like the corporate use case. Whereas ours is really geared towards investigative use case. So we have a lot of different kind of smart searches that you can do to really get the most out of our data.
Let's continue then, right? So, Tao.
Sure. So obviously we brought up Darkside a few times in the past. So Darkside is a repository of compromised PII. And the important thing is, while this webinar is on breach data, Darkside contains way more than just breach data. So we have obviously data from hacked database, et cetera, but we're literally interested in anything that has person identifying information that you can find on the deep and dark web. So that might include hacked databases. It'll include combo lists, obviously, the log stealer records that Ari was talking about. But we'll also have stuff in there like scrapes or marketing lists, lead generation lists. We'll have kind of what might be considered public records, but that are hard to get. For example, voter records in Honduras between 1995 and 2002, or every traffic stop in Moscow, in 2019, that might include VIN number, driver's license number, home address, phone number, et cetera. Financial transaction records, really anything. So it's not just stuff with passwords, it's just anything that has interesting person identifying information.
I should add to that, one of my favorite ones that occasionally I get is the TSA no-fly list, which has been immensely useful to me personally. I just would add to that in multiple investigations.
Yeah, the TSA fly list, no fly list is a good one. We also have like a list of, all Chinese Communist Party members, like it's just stuff that isn't technically a hacked database, but still is really, really interesting.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, we kind of went over that, slide already, but just it's a lot of it is pulling as much data as possible from these different breaches as well. So that's the other thing. Like, on a few slides ago, Ari mentioned, it's great to be able to pivot because you can then get the rest of the record, right? If you have the IP address, then you can see the name, phone number, et cetera, that they signed up with. Our whole kind of ethos as kind of investigators by heart is to extract as much data as possible from a record so you can pivot by as much as possible. So whereas kind of most organizations, when they're examining a breach, might pull out the username, password, email address, and name, like, okay, but here's another table where it lists every IP address that they ever used to connect to the service. Or here in this table, it shows that they once logged in with their Facebook account. So there's their Facebook ID. So we're going to pull all those IP addresses from the session table. We're going to pull all those social media IDs like Facebook ID, Google ID, GitHub ID, et cetera. Pull that all into the same record so that when you search by that GitHub ID or when you search by that IP address, you're going to get that full record. And it's obviously incredibly powerful to really get just pull as much data as possible. So you can search for as much data as possible to get as many meaningful results as possible.
Absolutely. I can't tell you the number of times I've searched in Darkside and then I to expecting a certain kind of result to be retrieved, and then I get something incredible, but that I did not foresee coming, to say the least, there. That then leads us to Falkor and Falkor's integration with Darkside. So Falkor is, as I describe it, essentially a holistic analyst platform, right? It's meant for teams and also individual analysts, but primarily teams. And you can then utilize it to carry out your investigations of any kind effectively. We'll take a look at it a little bit. You can upload any data, you can connect it to your databases, you can bring in files, you can visualize all those data points. You'll see all of this in a little bit, so I don't want to spend too much time on this, right? But then you can filter it to better, find certain shared attributes and patterns or so on, use graph algorithms, and really solve cases together in a really more impactful and holistic way. And of course, connect to any external API as required also. Now we'll see some of the upsides of integrating Darkside into Falkor as well, right? As well as, of course, all the case management features, all those fun things that we happen to have. But there's a lot of added value, I think, with taking the Darkside results and then visualizing them, be it on the map, be it via link analysis and via graph algorithms, to really know how to deal with a larger mass of data than you can usually work with in Darkside. So
Yeah, and just to add on, like the one reason obviously why we love Falkor is, Darkside's great, Darkside's amazing, obviously, but like the great thing with Falkor is you can integrate so many other data sources as well. So you can search for an email in Falkor using Darkside, and then find a social media handle or a social media account, and from there pivot to one of their other sources to then pull all the data from that social media profile. Maybe there you find a new name, and then you run that name through Darkside, and then that name gives you an IP address, and then you can use that IP address to a different search in Falkor. So it's really about kind of connecting all these different data sources together, and just being able to quickly pivot, because it's just, especially in an investigation, you go down these like crazy rabbit holes, and it's impossible. I mean, before link analysis, before all that, you used to write stuff down, and it just became a mess. So it's just beautiful to see it visualized as a link analysis in Falkor. Then there's also other views, just in case you're not super, or something that gets overly complicated, or sometimes you want to just kind of get a quick profile of it. So just kind of great to see in there.
Absolutely. So now let's discuss the actual use case, which we're going to jump in very quickly. Now, I imagine many of you here have heard of Lockbit, one of the world's leading, if not arguably the leading ransomware gang, right? By some estimates, responsible for up to 50% of all ransomware attacks globally. They have a well-known affiliate program, enabling other people to use their software to carry out attacks, right? Many of their affiliates and members have already been sanctioned or otherwise actioned. This is their famous blog where they will essentially post their victims, right, with the timer, the size of the ransom, what they had to do. Otherwise, they'd have their data leaked as part of the ransomware attack and so on. That's also, of course, double extortion. We don't need to go into that. That's a whole separate thing. Eventually, an international consortium of law enforcement, it's happened quite recently, of course, the FBI, Europol, the British NCA, and others were able to compromise Lockbit's site over here. After they compromised their site, they would then, of course, took it over and then set a timer to then dox Lockbits up, the main operator of Lockbit. They've already exposed and sanctioned other Lockbit operators like Bastardlord and so on. We don't need to go into them right now, but this is actually a real screenshot of the actual blog after it was taken over by international law enforcement. They published decryption keys and recovery tools, information on the indictments, and of course, information on the operators. So that then leads us to the actual indictment that we later on got. This individual over here. Also, here's maybe some noise in the background. Leo, would you mind?
Sorry, I'm almost ready.
Thanks. Okay. So we do have some information from the actual reward statement over here and the sanctions then placed by the US on Lockbits up. We have the individual's name, including variations of that name, date of birth, nationality, 2 email addresses, a cryptocurrency wallet, passport information, tax ID information, and more. Now, law enforcement provides you, or the American government provides you with this kind of initial step, right? But depending on what you happen to do for a living, whom you happen to work for, this can be useful to you in various capacities. This is critical, in of itself for sanctions. But if you work for, say, a bank or some sort of compliance role, you might want to expand upon this to make sure that any other crypto wallets aren't active on your platform, that the individual doesn't have any other email addresses, phone numbers, or anything else that could be essentially appearing on in your bank if you're owning an account, whatever it happens to be. The same goes for social media platforms, right? If you're in law enforcement, you might want to look into this guy to see if you can find any other information on local activity or any other local entities, right, that would be under your jurisdiction. And if you're in the cyberspace, you might want to use this to find new threat indicators and further expand upon this individual, right? This is not the end all be all by any means of the information that we have available. So on that note, I'm going to stop sharing my screen briefly and pull up Falkor, and we'll dive right into it. Sorry, I have a Mac here. I'm still getting used to it. Okay. So this is the Falkor homepage. Falkor, like we said earlier, it's a full analyst operating system. There's case management integrated. You can upload files, create entities. There's a whole dashboard here as well, showing you where your cases are. You have a full task management suite, right, as well. There are notifications for collaboration. This is all editable. You can see your shared notifications and activity that you have going on here as well. So quick look at the case management suite. You can see, certain tasks and things being assigned to different analysts. A lot of fun stuff here. If anybody wants to see that more in depth, feel free to contact us afterwards, and we're happy to take you more through there. So now you have some other options, right? You can initially begin, well, you can begin essentially by starting here. Sorry, we'll go to the side over here. You can start by opening a case if you want. Here we have a large number of open cases. There's also a full backend database. So all of these cases and the data that you connect to them and add to them and bring in gets stored in the full backend database. But you can also begin the case inside of the search, right? There's a full profiler and keyword search as well. So we can search in here, including, of course, searching in District 4 based upon name, phone number, hashed password, domain, password, crypto wallet, passport, whatever you want to do. And let's see what this sort of result looks like. Here we're searching the individual's full name over here in Russian. So this will run for a second as it's querying essentially a large number of sources, and then it's going to visualize all the results for this. There we go. Now, in this case, we received just under 400 different results, including, unsurprisingly, a number in Russia. Now, this is quite a bit, right? We only have essentially the name. We could look up the email addresses, and we'll get to those in a little bit. This is a lot to work with, right? We could select all of these, pivot, looked in the District 4 leaked records for full information on each individual record, as we can see here. And by the way, you can really see the value of each individual record over here as well, with all of the information that you can pull from these, right? These may not have been necessarily related individuals, but here we have company records with full addresses, right? Domain registration. This is in fact an email belonging to him that we can then pivot off of. Information on the actual leak and so on. There's tons of stuff that we can do here, but this is still a little hard to kind of kick off with. So on that note, let's take a look at what it would look like inside of an actual case once we bring in all of the data. I decided to make it a bit more straightforward. I created here a link analysis chart. There are, of course, other views as well. We'll look at those in a little bit, of all of the entities belonging to this individual. Here we have him in the middle with all of his data points. We can also enrich him as well if we want, search his name, search get his personal information and so on. We have his various usernames added. We have his crypto wallet added, which we can look up to get sanctions and chain analysis or query in District 4, and his email addresses. I personally prefer querying and beginning with email addresses. I've also marked that over here as well. In Falkor, you can mark entities based upon various attributes they have. Each entity also has a profile. You can add notes as well, which form kind of the backbone of a later report. And you can also filter by entity types on the entity palette over here. So now that we have the base layer of entities related to this individual, let's begin by querying this email address in District 4. There are other tools we can use. We can use domain tools. We can use Epios. We can use other tools as well, like Matteo said earlier, to really integrate District 4 into your other tooling. And also to save time, right? You can query multiple tools simultaneously. If you want to get certain live accounts, for example, at the same time, it's not a problem. So we just retrieved via District 4 just over 20 entities. We'll use the graph algorithm up here, right, to then reorganize that data. So we can see that he owns this email address, and this email address is affiliated with a number of other leaks. The leaked records are the entities that we see here in blue, and we can click on any one of these at any point in time to see the record in its entirety, right? So here we have, for example, the hash password, the address, the user ID, the date registered, affiliated phone number, and more. We can then look through the actual leaked records themselves to see if there's anything of interest. We can see here, for example, that he appears in a leak as well, that he registered, in this case, a certain company, I believe, under this name, right? In this case, CDEC is, I believe, a courier, but I'm not entirely sure. I haven't looked into that one. If I'm correct, yeah, is that correct, Matteo? There we go. And we can look into other ones as well. Here we have his Yandex food leak, right? Which I think was one of my favorites, where you have not only the individual's email address and phone number, right? But you also have a specific address in, I think, Voronezh, Russia over here, including other past addresses as well that we can see that appear in the system, right? So not only have we gone from this guy's email address, but we've gone to his specific addresses in Russia. Now, one of the leaks that I thought was most interesting was the Alpha Bank leak over here. It was hacked in 2024. Alpha Bank is a bank here in Russia. And not only do we have a full record on this guy with his full name and several phone numbers, but we have a full email address appearing over here as well. Matteo, anything you want to add before we continue?
I was gonna say, like, the Alpha Bank also had bank account numbers as well in there. Like, it was just a huge breach. So like very interesting PII in there. And here it's interesting because you had essentially two email addresses connected with it. So another great, source to pivot. So you search for one email address, you get that record, and it gives you a new email address. And that's because we were able to determine that they were basically, like, I don't think they had two email addresses in the actual record in the database. But we looked over this entire database and we're like, oh wait, that's the same guy. That's the same guy. Let's merge that together. So now that when you do a search, you're going to get that second email address in there. But most typical tools, you would only get that first email address in there because they wouldn't merge those two records together.
Absolutely. And again, I think the point to really drive home is that this is information you really can't get anywhere else, right? This immediate connection. This guy's bank records are only going to appear in breach data. That's the only way to acquire it ethically and legally, essentially. From here, let's then take that email address, which appears to be interesting, and then again get the leaked data on that as well. We'll let that run for a moment. There we go. That retrieved just under 60 entities. So again, we'll use the graph algorithm to reorganize that. There we go. And this is where we start to see, in my opinion, the real added upside of visualizing via Falkor, right, with Darkside. So traditionally, you would see this, right, in kind of a table view, which we have also in Falkor, right? But you would see it like we saw in the profiler also a little bit earlier. Results in a table, you have to look through the various results, essentially like this. Again, in Falkor, this is categorized by entity type, right? But you'd be looking at essentially textual results of the search that you just ran. Whereas thanks to the link analysis, you can just go back here and see immediately what's actually going on. This email address appeared in that leak. We can see that it appears in these leaks over here as well, with this email address being shared to these various leaks, including breach combinations and more. And this email address ending in an A, which is a common convention that we'll see in as passwords later on, by the way, appearing in these also. We can also see other individual leaks appearing over here as well, with, in this case, various hash passwords, right? So we can really effectively cluster and better understand instantaneously what's happening with this. And that's, I think, one of the big upsides of utilizing Falkor with Darkside. And then from here, we get one more interesting result from Zloy.bz. Here in the other fields, we get an ICQ user ID. He hasn't utilized it for the past 13 or so years. As you can see, it was last active in 2011, but we do have it, which is an interesting thing to have. I think it's a fascinating finding to add alongside this. And we even have an IP address also. We can then, for example, query in this IP address if we wanted to query it in District 4, or we can just use it inside of Falkor to get IP details to geolocate the IP address. And then see, perhaps this is from Russia. If he was using a VPN, it might be in Europe or America, whatever it happens to be. Right, we'll take a look at that on the map later on. This one actually appears to be in Russia, in Voronezh, therefore indicating this may in fact actually be an email address, an IP address that was owned or belonged by the individual. Of course, it could still be unrelated, right? He could have been in a cafe or another location. There's no way to say. It could be a mobile. I believe, in fact, it might actually be a mobile IP address. But the point remains, we can still utilize that also. Now,
And
what's interesting here is, oh yeah.
I was gonna say, like, and just to kind of put the finer point on it, like, yeah, that record coming from 2011 was, that's before he started really getting involved in all this, obviously in the ransomware business, obviously before Lockbit, et cetera. But that forum, the Zloy.bz, was a Russian hacking forum back then. I don't think it's still around anymore. But you're seeing records from 13, 14 years ago. You're getting an IP address from 14 years ago. And I think that one actually was a legitimate IP address. So then it's like, okay, if you're law enforcement, you can obviously subpoena that IP address, see who owned it at that moment in time. So you have that date there, 2011, whatever it was. And then, yeah, to that point with the ICQ number. This is an ICQ number that this individual had. And we don't do it in this demo, but you could pivot on that ICQ number. You can search that ICQ number to see, all right, maybe he created another account under a completely different name, completely different email address, username, different IP address, etc. But he still wanted to be contacted by ICQ, so you would get that result. And that's kind of the beauty of this, is you can search by all these different identifiers, do all these beautiful pivots, and some cases pivot essentially through time and go 13, 14 years back when he used his home IP address instead of a IP address, VPN or something.
Absolutely. And then from here also, I wasn't familiar with Zloy. I don't spend a lot of time in the Russian cybercrime scene myself personally. But if that's a hacking forum, for example, then this username might be indicative. Now, this isn't unique enough for me to say, oh yeah, we absolutely need to pivot upon this. It's super unique and we're going to have just, high quality results. But luckily with Falkor, we can still take the large number of results that we'll retrieve from the username query, and we can then organize that more effectively, right? So this is unique enough, I'd say. We'll query this. We'll just wait a moment and we'll retrieve a fair amount of data, just under 300 results, which is quite a bit. So our canvas is starting to get a bit messy over here. Let's hit the layout button again. Sorry, 1 second here.
And actually, while you're organizing, one of the other things to note, again, kind of going to the point of trying to make this as user-friendly as possible for investigators. So you notice in this case, it was, narrow wolf kind of all as one word. But, District 4 as an investigator, you basically, understand that people might, as a username, represent it in different ways. So it might be narrow_wolf or narrow -wolf or narrow wolf 123 or all those different things. So we search for all those variations. So it doesn't matter what punctuation they included. None of that matters. And if you want to kind of do a wildcard search, you can do that as well. So yeah, there you have an example of narrow_wolf that will get returned. And the beauty of showing the different representations is when you pull it out of, Falkor and you see that, narrow wolf is him, and also he also used narrow_wolf. Our system doesn't care about that stuff, but other systems do. So if you do like a username search, using Falkor, that's going to, care about the punctuation. So you're going to want to have both variations there. But either way, it's just trying to get as much data as possible. So then you can then filter the results out.
Absolutely. So here we have a case, like Matteo just said, where by querying narrow wolf, which by the way, we can see the results here clustered, right, pretty nicely. So we can see immediately what's being shared here to various leaks, this password, for example, and other passwords and so on, right? Can be a bit hard to otherwise understand, but we can essentially zoom out and see what's being shared out from this cluster to other clusters, right? So down here, we have this email address and these leaks that also have appeared as the default of emails appeared in them also as well, right? So we can utilize the visualization to immediately find this email address. And the same goes for this one as well, right? This 3k@zacep.ru, where he had, in fact, the same Nero_wolf. So considering that this email address has appeared in leaks with both Nero wolf and Nero_wolf, that's a bit suspicious. We can utilize that to then pivot upon and assume that it belongs to him in the meantime. So let's take the leaked data over here. By the way, we'll just pull up the leaks over here. You can see like this is some like fascinating information where you have from like a VDS provider, right? A hosting provider essentially. So you can really get a lot of varied kinds of data points into this sort of individual who would be, of course, quite active in hosting due to his chosen profession, right? That we would then be able to look at. So we just brought back some more entities. Let's recluster again. There we go. Now, this is starting to get, I wouldn't say a bit messy. We can still kind of immediately understand what's more central here and what's less central, right? But we can really start to see how different entity types over here begin to connect this larger mass together. And by the way, we do get a variety of other query types over here. We got some Nero wolf, some other various varieties of Nero wolf and so on over here that we can look at, but we'll put those in the side for now, right? Going back over here, we can now see essentially after having enriched this Zacep email address, we can see really cleanly the passwords that this guy has utilized for this email address when registering it in various other places online. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8A. He loves adding A to his email addresses. The password blowup, the password 2259848, right, which also appears in this leak over here with a different phone number and so on, right? And then we can also see, for example, other leaks as well. This one, this black energy one we know is also relevant. It also appears within one of the shared IP addresses in the past. The A one over here also connects. Essentially, there's a lot of work that we can do here to really see how this guy operates online effectively across all of these, right? So what we'll do now is I want to go back to that Dark Tower email address that we had over here. And by the way, we can see that over here in this leak, for example, he's utilized this same password with this email address and so on, further providing some insight into that specific use of this guy. We'll then query this one for leak data.
And while you're waiting for that to query, just to kind of put another point on the kind of password search, like, so this subject, I mean, even though he is, this, crazy, most wanted threat actor pretty much in the world right now, you see he used really bad and common passwords. So we're not going to pivot on those passwords directly. But the beauty with another kind of thing that we use to enrich our data and to make our data more searchable at Darkside is we crack millions, hundreds of millions of passwords every day so that you can search by password as well. So I can't tell you how many cases like we and our customers have cracked by doing that password search. So if you have someone, for example, who's created 50 different accounts using 50 different email addresses and 50 different usernames, etc., a lot of people, kind of creatures of habit kind of thing, will use the same password for all 50 of those accounts. And a lot of people maybe will get creative and have like a more complex password. So you can then search for that password. So if you had an uncommon password, you would see everybody who's used that uncommon password, which is more often than not going to be your subject. You might have to filter one or two people out, but more often than not, a unique password is going to be a unique identifier as well as an email addresses. And to be able to search that many, well, obviously combo lists, they're already plain text passwords, but you also have so many cracked passwords that we're searching. So just incredibly, incredibly useful for threat attribution, for connecting accounts that you wouldn't otherwise be able to connect. Because on the surface, different email, different phone number, different username, let alone the breach records where you're just seeing a username on like, a Twitter site or a live journal or something like that. But in Darkside, you can see the password that they use and you can see that it's the same one.
Absolutely. And then this is where the Falkor side comes in. We can see that this IP address, which is something that I personally don't love pivoting on in many cases due to the fact that it can be so, it's hard to prove some sort of, real relation here, appears in so many different leaks, right? That's starting to get a little indicative at this point. And this is the one that's based in Voronezh, Russia, right? So we can then maybe assume that he either frequents this place at the minimum, right? If not necessarily his home IP address or whatever happens to be. So this is something, once it appears in 5 or 6 breaches, we can start to make some other referrals here and then really begin to look more into that IP address, let's say. So I would say then, for example, I'm sorry, moving the Zoom thing over here, mark that specific one as a target. Now, there's some other stuff we can do. And by the way, we haven't even touched the half of it with this guy. He has a network of domains he's registered. He has other things. We can go into him, till the cows come home, essentially, right? But we already are starting to understand effectively what's happening with him. We have a lot of information. We have these various clusters showing us of activity. But now, how do you really take this forward from here, right? Well, there are a few things. One of the first things that we can do is take a look at the map view. So the map view is an upside of Falkor also, where we can see any geolocated entities. So we can see some of the IP addresses here that we geolocated. Again, St. Petersburg, some one of the Netherlands, VPNs presumably. But we also have some where he's actually based over here in Voronezh. We have some addresses that have appeared in the breach records. We have one over here also. And we even have one IP address appearing essentially over here, still within the general range, I would say, of a specific ISP range, like of an ASN. IP geolocation isn't really that accurate. People always forget this, right? It's not accurate really to the level of building, unless you go talk to your individual ISP and have some sort of warrant, right? But this is already starting to show that we can probably assume this is his home IP address based upon the proximity of this to his actual listed home addresses over here, right? So things to consider, right? We can start to make some smarter things, assumptions that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. Now, going back to the link analysis, we can then filter the entity types based upon the entity types, their properties, all of that fun stuff, depending on what you need. Maybe you're interested just in email addresses, right? Maybe you're interested just in phone numbers or whatever happens to be, or just in central entities. You can do that. You can also filter out for everything but certain types. So if we want to find, for example, a Twitter account, by the way, this is his real Twitter account over here, right? We can simply filter for everything but Twitter, select that, and then we're good to go. And then we can use Falkor to then get the tweets, followers, following, all the information on that specific account, look up the account itself in District 4, for example, based upon the user ID, see if it appears in the Twitter leaks, which it may well, for example, and keep going from there, right? So we can play with this to filter out for specific entity types. We can take notes. We can even kind of understand it as is in terms of the central entities from here. But what we can also do is we can filter by degree, right? The total number of relations that these have. So by doing so, getting to a minimum of 3, right? Show me only entities that have at least 3 connections. We can already remove most of the extraneous entities, let's say, right? So we can get to this degree to then see, for example, the number of more central nodes that we see over here, right? The key email addresses, the key passwords, the key IP addresses, and all that fun stuff, and even key leaks and so on, right? The Nearwolf one is, of course, quite big, to more effectively filter down information and to make it more manageable to work with. The final thing we can do is if we have 2 nodes of interest, let's say, for example, this node, we're just selecting randomly for this, and this node, right? I'm going to move the zoom thing here briefly. We can click shortest path, And the system will show you the shortest nature of relationship, right? The shortest path between those two specific nodes. So when you have a larger mass of nodes that you need to work with, you can easily do that and then make it more accessible. The final thing that we can then do, and then we'll take some time for questions, is generate a report. So you can select all the paths that you want, which are like folders in the case, assign the target profile to whoever you'd like in this, share it with other people in the case as well. Like we said, there's a full case management element over here as well for other people, if in your case, if they're assigned to it, and then click export. Doesn't take very long. I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll pull up the report that I have over here, which I believe was popping up anyway during the presentation. And then I think we can take some time for questions. So we export reports in Falkor into Word. You can see the target profile with all the information that we have on him that we added to the system earlier or pulled in from APIs. And we have the information from paths, right? So we don't always have necessarily all these various fields. You can choose to filter out whatever you want to filter out and so on. But if you want to have just all the entities, in this case, I selected all of them, right? Added over here as required. You can do that and then edit it based upon whatever you need. This isn't going to replace a full report feature. Nothing really ever can, but this is meant to give you the foundation that you need to export all of that data effectively, right? Take that and then write a report on top of it. There's also a full export to CSV feature if needed as well. So on that note, I think we've probably talked everyone's ear off here. I think it might be time for some questions.
Yeah, we do have a few more minutes. So if anybody has any questions, please let us know. You can also write them in the chat or just speak.
I see we got one question on where the sources are from. Matteo, do you want to maybe speak about how you guys actually gather this data?
Sure. So we're an American-based company, and obviously we need to stay on the right side of the law. So every data set that we collect is following Department of Justice guidelines. What that means is that we do not purchase data, and obviously we don't hack any companies ourselves. Because we've been doing this kind of stuff for so long, and we've kind of embedded ourselves in all these different threat actor communities, we're in places where data that is otherwise sold is given to us freely, which is obviously very nice. So all the data is ethically sourced, and we let you know where every record comes from. So like in the demo we were showing, like, came from this Russian bank, or it came from this Russian hacking site, or a scrape of Twitter, or a scrape of LinkedIn. We'll let you know where it came from, give you information about the breach, when the breach occurred, how many users were affected, what PII was affected. Because it's all very, and what it is, right? This is a Russian bank. This is a, Chinese social media site. This is a whatever, to help provide additional context that you can use in your investigation or in litigation or report.
It's all a forum to table, if you don't mind my if you're not calling it that, that's what you should be. That's what you should be doing, in my opinion.
Noted.
Anyway, we'll pull up the presentation over here just to have that in the background if anybody has any questions about the specific presentation. In the meantime, we're happy to take some more questions then. Yeah, Matteo, we received one here about the chain of custody.
So there, that might be more of a Falkor question. I mean, basically, so what we're doing is we have this massive repository of data that you're collecting data from. We basically parse all the data internally and then index it. We also spend time verifying that the data is what it says it is. A lot of threat actors will pass off like older breaches as newer breaches, or mislabel things, etc. So we spend time to try to figure out, the breach is what it is. And because we're oftentimes getting, the raw SQL dumps of these databases, we can see that. We can say like, oh, this is claiming it's from, MySpace, and we look at the first 3 users of this SQL table, and it's admin at MySpace and support at MySpace and whatever, and then we see the password matches, and then we see, if we go to a username that's included there, that it matches to a MySpace profile. It's like, okay, this is probably MySpace. If we can't tell whether it's legitimate or not, and we can't determine that it's mislabeled database or it's a fake database, etc., we might still include it in our repository, just because it might have PII that we didn't have before or something like that, but we'll add a label and say, hey, this is unverified. We're not sure whether this is authentic or not, but it appears to be legitimate. And, from there, we just put it into our cluster, and then, Falkor will pull that data into their system. So we wouldn't be able to file a chain of custody per se, but at the end of the day, this is data we're collecting directly from the deep and dark web. We're not leveraging any third-party data sources or tools, etc. There is a Darkside analyst collecting this data and then indexing it into our data set.
And then on Falkor's end, I mean, we do the typical stuff. Every entity is assigned a specific hash and user ID and so on regarding that. I need some more information specifically to kind of go more in depth on what would be needed on that end, right? But we essentially just take it from District 4, assign it its own UID, and go from there.
Great, thank you guys. Another question that came up is like, can we try it out? So absolutely. It's possible to get a trial of Falkor along with the Darkside source. So just visit our website, talk to us. You can send us an email and we'll talk a bit more about that and see what your requirements are for your team.
Absolutely.
All right. So if there are no more questions, thank you so much, Ari and Matteo, and thanks everyone for joining. We'll be sending a recording later this week. And yeah, see you next time, hopefully.